Hi everyone, Magnus here, covering the match that was just played in the Speed Chess Championship quarterfinals between Magnus Carlsen and Arjun Erigaisi. In this one, Magnus does come out with the win, 3-point advantage, therefore advancing to play Hans Niemann in the long-awaited rematch. But before talking about any of that, or even speculating, it is time. I have selected three very nice games from the match that was just played, and I think we have got going to take a look at them with you. So starting off with the first game in the 5-minute portion of the Blitz. This is, I think, a very nice game that Magnus played. Almost perfect accuracy, as you probably saw in the thumbnail. And yeah, so earlier on, Magnus was playing some pretty weird sidelines, not too many main lines or theoretical positions, and he was having a bit of a tough time, so he did switch it up, and he started to play some proper chess, going into a Queen's Gambit declined, trying for the Catalan opening, which he is quite famous for. Bishop g2. A6, he plays this move, knight e5, which is a bit of a sideline. Generally, we see castles, so obviously Magnus testing out Arjun just a little bit here. Bishop to b4 played. Magnus develops his knight, blocking the check. Arjun jumps in, pressuring this horsey over here, saying, Magnus, would you like to give me your prized bishop? Of course, Magnus does not. Magnus simply castles the king, and he sacrifices yet another pawn. As you can see, this is the Catalan. All the pawns on the queen side are pretty much gone, but black has just wandered out with a bishop, only piece being developed here, and is, possibly even Magnus about to lose another pawn here, as you can see with queen takes. So after rook to b1, the queen is also capturing. So white temporarily down 3 pawns, but so much development. Look at this monster bishop, absolutely lasering the position. The rook teaming up on pressuring this weak b pawn. The queen ready to get out of the way and bring the rook into the game. This knight is absolutely ready to pounce, preventing any development from black. And at a moment's notice, even this bishop could make it into the game. So I mean, I know I'm drawing a lot of arrows here, but like this position just looks so nice to play for white. Queen a4 check is getting played. I was expecting, most people were expecting pawn to b5 here, and if the pawn were to go to b5, apparently Magnus should have gone queen to a3 here, not going for the tempting looking rook to b5, because after this capture, queen captures, queen takes e5. Apparently, queen takes b8 doesn't land you in a very good position. Possibly Arjun was actually afraid of this, but even though you do go down down the exchange, and it looks like bishop to f4 is coming, and it looks like you are winning back another pawn. Apparently, all of these extra pawns, actually, sorry, I'm just, no, because white already sacrificed the exchange. But basically, there's this long sequence, and white would end up down a pawn and holding a slightly worse position. Arjun didn't go for this. Maybe he was familiar with this queen to a3 response, which prevents castling and does look quite annoying, giving up the knight and taking the rook here. He might have not liked the look of this. Anyway, he goes knight to d7, allowing Magnus this great move, bringing his bishop into development. As you can see, all of Magnus's pieces lasering down the queen side, ready to bring the rook into the game, and still this bishop pressuring this pawn here. It looks like an absolutely overwhelming position for white. Clearly some preparation by Magnus. He's up a lot on the clock, actually not that much anymore. He was up a lot on the clock, only used 15 seconds while Arjun already down a minute and a half. Obviously Magnus unfamiliar with this move, so he knows that after there's a move that he doesn't know the top response to, he knows it's going to be a small mistake, so he can take his time to think and come up with the right move to play in the position, which of course he does with bishop to f4. We see a retreat here, but now the bishop can simply capture on b7, which it does. And after this capture of the knight, actually Magnus comes up with a really nice move, bishop to e3, saying that I'm not going to rush with taking any of these other pieces. I'm just going to get a tempo on your queen, grab the rook, and after the queen moves back, simple capture here. And while the material is presently equal, white is up the exchange, and these extra pawns that black has to their name are so split and so weak that they're simply going to get attacked and drop off the board. So we actually see c3, which is a little trick here. The idea being that what was it? Yeah, if you wanna bring the rook to the c file, basically I think the idea is if you want to bring the rook, then this pawn would be defended, can potentially go to c2, and possibly the pawn would be quite difficult to chop off the board. So basically just getting this pawn to a protected square where it will always be a threat of promoting. But Magnus, of course, bishop to d4 played, preventing any of this from happening and immediately looking to get black's strongest piece, the dark squared bishop, off the board so that he can then capture the c3 pawn. We do see pawn to c2 here. Another small trick, basically saying if you were to take my bishop, I would take your rook, and even though this position is still better for white, black has definitely made a big improvement. So anyway, of course, Magnus just saves his rook, trades down, grabs the pawn here, and he's now got a small material advantage, which is going to grow after Arjun does set up some counterplay on this e2 pawn. But Magnus simply grabs this pawn with check, king moves, and then he re-centralizes the bishop. Arjun does start to lash out with this move, pawn to f5, Magnus brings back the bishop, and f4, making some pretty scary looking advancements on the king side. Arjun does go for queen g5 with a little trap for Magnus. If you were to go for the natural move, rook to c5, there is knight to f3 check, discovered attack on the rook. Apparently this position, once again, is still good for white. Just because of how split up and crazy this black pawn structure is, absolutely all over the place, while the white pawns are nice and compact. But Magnus doesn't blunder that, he simply grabs another pawn, and after f3, another really creative try by Arjun, saying that you cannot take this way because your rook would hang, although you actually can take this way because white would simply be, after king actually, white would be up so many pieces and the threat of f4 that white is still completely winning. But instead he goes for bishop f3, and Arjun finds this also really creative move, bishop to d3, idea being that if you were to take here, there would be knight takes f3 and king g2, and maybe queen to h5, and all of a sudden there's a scary looking attack. Admittedly, there isn't actually anything here, but at the very least, he is trying very valiantly to try and do some damage to Magnus. But Magnus, of course, just plays calm and collected, queen to b7. He's built up such a big time advantage at this point that he can really take the big things when he needs them and get the win. Arjun does sacrifice the rook, but Magnus simply sacrifices his rook right back at you. And after this position, this transformation, Magnus is still left up the exchange. Black has a shattered pawn structure, and pawn to f4, one last try. Magnus finds this nice move, queen to b8 check. The idea being that after the king moves, you can sacrifice the rook and attract the king into a capture here, forcing queens off the board into a very easily winning endgame. Magnus is up 3 pawns and has a rook for a bishop. This is over. So, game number 2 that I've chosen for you guys. Magnus has the black pieces, and it is he's playing once again one of his classic sidelines. I'm flipping the board so that we can look from his perspective. Pawn to d4, d6. We've got a Gurganitsa. I don't know if this is the Norwegian rat. The chess.com is coming up with the rat defense. I know that Magnus is a big fan of the Norwegian rat, even though he doesn't think it's a very good opening. But he gets this kind of Caro-Kann-esque modern system known as the Gurganitsa. Knight comes out to f3, and we get some pretty normal development by Arjun, all the pieces and space in the center, potentially looking to trade off this bishop here. Meanwhile, Magnus pushing pawns one square in very strange ways and attacking on the side of the board without developing anything. So, you know, Magnus just doing Magnus things. Arjun, once again, very principled. Look at these pieces. How could you not want the white position? But, you know, Magnus castles, we get bishop to h6, trading off black's strong bishop. Bishop comes out to g5, potentially looking to damage the structure here. E5, Arjun says, I don't care. If you want to take here, I can always castle long because I've not committed the king yet. I'm going to spend my time striking back in the center, trying to tear open the position and potentially get to these weak diagonals. Magnus does capture, we get another capture, and things start coming off the board. But not before Arjun starts launching an attack of his own with this h-pawn coming down the board and the queen that could access the h6 square. This could potentially be quite a dangerous attack for white. So, pawn to h5 played, Magnus saying, no, you cannot move your pawn forward any further. Knight comes into g5. Getting out of this potential capture, which would ruin the structure. Queen comes out to c7, pressuring the pawn. And we do get a capture in the center, maybe slightly disrupting the black position here, as the b5 pawn is weak. But Arjun decides not to take the b5 pawn because in that case the e5 pawn would hang, and then all of these other pawns would hang, and the white would in fact be caught, having not castled the king. So queen to e3 guarding the pawn here, but after pawn to d4, another very creative move by Magnus, saying if you want to take with the queen, I'm going to play knight to c6, hit these two pieces, and then I'm going to capture the pawn with a check. So instead the queen goes to g3, knight to c6 anyway, and pawn to f3, kicking the bishop back, followed by pawn to f4, now guarding the pawn here. Potentially you could choose to move the bishop right back, but Magnus instead probably goes for knight to b4, hitting the bishop on d3. Castles, Magnus captures the bishop, and after a recapture, he can now outpost his own bishop on this really nice f5 square, pressuring this pawn and stopping any advancement of the white pawns in their tracks. Rook goes to the c-file, Magnus gets out of the way, occupying the c-file, and this knight to d6 move is a creative way to force off the queens. The queen has to take, otherwise you're getting forked up. So Magnus does trade the queens. Takes on f5 here. The idea being that Arjun doesn't want to go down a piece because he did just play knight d6 if he were to take back. And instead he wants to slightly damage Magnus' structure. But actually this structure is kind of an improvement for black because now you have this file to operate on. These positions are actually really nice with this kind of damaged pawn structure because it allows the rook to come in and pressure from all these different angles and harass these pawns. And it's actually very solid as long as the king is kind of like the glue supporting all of the pawns here. So we do see capture followed by e6, Magnus preventing a pawn e6 sacrifice himself. And Magnus starts expanding, plays king h6 covering up, and rook g8. We get a classic staring contest of all the rooks looking at one another, basically saying who's going to capture who first. So Arjun decides to take on c8, and Magnus, after recapturing, will have this g file covered, so it doesn't look like a big deal. Actually, he decides not to play rook takes c8, I guess because then Arjun could then do the same thing, and this is probably a draw with the two kings covering the key infiltration squares, and neither rook really having anything to do. Instead, Magnus does play for the win, goes for rook takes on g1, which does look like a risky decision considering all these pawns are ripe for the picking, but actually Magnus is the one getting to the pawns first with this check on the second rank. So the king goes to f2 here, but now Magnus has access rook to b1, hitting the pawn and threatening to take with check, which he goes for. Rook comes back to c2. Now we have passive defense, and you never want to be in a situation where you're the guy with the rook with the passive defense. This is absolutely horrible to hold. Magnus is just going to push, 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 take space, start poking you on this side. He's threatening to come this way. It's just going to be an absolute nightmare to hold. Pawn to a3 played. Arjun trying to hold on, set up the perfect fortress, but Magnus is poking. He's attacking this pawn here, trying to force king e2, then he'll come back over and start harassing all these pawns, which he does. And after this simple check, this pawn falls. Arjun tried to get an active defense, bringing out his rook, but as soon as the rook goes forward, Magnus smacks him back down and says, no, you will not be escaping with the active defense here. And after king c1, Magnus simply moves his rook. We get a couple more moves. Arjun forced to the back rank. Magnus now collecting all the pawns, and Arjun simply resigns because the entire position is collapsing. So a very nice technical game by Magnus with the black pieces, demonstrating once again his patented endgame technique. But then again, Arjun was in fact striking back in the bullet. As you can see, Arjun actually has a very high bullet rating, 3200. Magnus has slumped a little bit with 3187. I mean, it's quite funny to say that someone's rating is slumping when they're in the 3000s for rating, but that's just the world we live in on chess.com. These top players all having bullet ratings between like 3100 and 3500 even at their peaks. So, Magnus opens pawn to d4. We get a French defense by Arjun. Pretty standard moves in the advanced French. Magnus going for a slightly more positional setup with bishop to e2, knight g7, and knight to a3. Magnus looking to get his knight back into the game via c2. Knight goes out to g6. I mean, instantly on knight g6, I'm thinking h4, h5, but obviously that is quite primitive. Magnus just goes for castles, the second choice of the engine. Arjun plays f6, looking to instantly break out. He's got his two horses attacking the center, and now this f6 pawn. Magnus, of course, captures. You don't want to let them destroy your position in the center. And he gets his knight into the game. So that it can now recapture, and you've got these two pawns to worry about with black, but at the same time there is good play with this open f-file, and there's definitely strong attacking chances. Of course, the bishop is preserved. We see castles, and actually a pawn sacrifice by Arjun. A very interesting position here. Black is apparently still doing quite well, probably because there are all these attacking chances on the king. Look at this bishop down there. And Arjun's bishop pair's just slightly better activated than White's. White's pieces are a bit all over the place. Although, admittedly, a pawn is a pawn is a pawn. And Magnus does get into an endgame where he is a pawn up, but at the cost of transitioning the bishop pair over to Arjun. And we know how deadly the bishop pair can be. Magnus centralizing his rooks. Playing a3, trying to get his pawn off an attacked square from this bishop here so he can activate his a-rook. The knights come off, and the bishop come to e5. And as you can see, look at this bishop pair. They're covering like literally the whole board. They're defending, they're attacking, absolute monster bishops here in the center. Rook comes to the middle, and when black is better and and down a pawn, you know there's going to be trouble. Rook to f7, which is a pretty devilish little move by Arjun. The idea being that at any moment now there can be a discovery on the f2 pawn, which Magnus does go for knight to b5, harassing this a7 pawn, and it does give up the b pawn, but Magnus is thinking, okay, I'll get back the a pawn, and then I'll try and consolidate the position. But after knight takes on a7 and bishop takes on a3, all of a sudden there is this threat with this attack on the knight and the f2 pawn, followed by a potential discovery on the rook, which could win the game with all of these fork possibilities. Magnus plays rook b1, which is a big blunder, falling for this tactic here, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn, discoverable square on a2, and the game is effectively lost as Magnus loses the exchange. Bishop comes back with a check, and in fact he doesn't just lose an exchange, he loses the full rook and decides to resign the game. This was one of the last bullet games. Unfortunately for Arjun, the lead was too big to overcome. It was 5 games, I think. Going into the bullet portion, Arjun did narrow the victory down to just 3 games. So definitely good fighting spirit by Arjun. And yeah, so we'll be looking forward to seeing the Magnus versus Hans Niemann game in live over the board to come. But if you did enjoy this recap video for the time being, please do consider liking and subscribing. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.